Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and today we're going to go to Washington, D.C., and have a look around at one of the places that I find a really inspiring place. It's called Nonviolence International, and we're going to talk to the director, who's Michael Beer. And his new book is kind of an updating, if I'm not mistaken, of the findings that were made almost a generation ago, I would say now, by Gene Sharp, who wrote a book called The Politics of Nonviolence. It was a 2-volume masterly work on the history of nonviolent struggles, about how to use nonviolence for peaceful struggle. You know, peace being the lack of violence, but nevertheless not the lack of conflict. So good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Metta. It is an honor to be with you, a tremendous futurist thinker and activist for peace and justice in the world. And I just think what you're doing is amazing and hope the whole world will take your videos seriously and not just go to one or two, but really make it a part of their weekly news imbibing, that they will come and watch your videos. So thank you.
So we are in a two-person mutual admiration society today. And because what you do at Nonviolence International is also of enormous importance, I think.
Let's start the show off by quoting Dr. King's well-known quote about our choice between nonviolence and non-existence. And some people may think that that's a slight exaggeration, but I don't. I take it seriously. I think it's an accurate choice that we have, and particularly with nuclear weapons, but with all these other modern technologies that can destroy human life quickly. We really have to choose between nonviolence and non-existence. And I, for one, and I know Metta, you as well, we choose nonviolence. Doesn't mean that nonviolence is easy or that there's a simple formula, because the nonviolence universe is a very exciting and broad one in which there are many disagreements and different approaches within the fields of nonviolence. My book, called The Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century, is really focused on a survey of the field of nonviolent action today, and talking about the vast differences that we have within the field of nonviolence, and gray areas on the margins of what some people would consider nonviolence and other people would not. So I'm hoping all of you will go and download the free PDF of Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century. It's been published by the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, which is the great research publication place on nonviolent resistance in the last 20 years. And you can also, if you want to get a paper version of this, you can go to Amazon and get your paper version and pay, or an EPUB version, EPUB referring to e-publication. But it's a free PDF on the Nonviolence International website, and I would encourage you to come and see that. So yes, indeed, nonviolence is an exciting arena that is going to help save the planet. And Gene Sharp wrote his book in 1973, 2 generations ago. Nobody's updated it since, and I kept asking for people to update it, and nobody would do it. And so finally, even though I'm not a professional researcher or academic, I took it upon myself, with the support of Nonviolence International, to write this book. And what we have alongside this book, which is equally exciting, is we have a database that is online for the world to use. It's called the Tactics Database, or the Global Tactics Database. And the URL is easy. It's tactics.nonviolenceinternational.net. And we have 350 tactics that Gene Sharp referred to as methods on our website, and it's growing all the time with more examples, more photographs, and new tactics that we put up. And a lot has happened in 50 years. The nonviolent universe has exploded. We now have nonviolent action going on in almost every country of the world, almost every single day. There are 194, 195 countries, and there's hardly a country where there isn't nonviolent action going on even every day. Even in North Korea, even in very repressive states, there are nonviolent actions going on. Obviously lower risk ones in many cases, but and in many now in the digital realm that did not exist 50 years ago when this first was all cataloged. So people are using this because they think it's effective.
Well, I don't want to divert you already, but we're going to get to it eventually anyway. Is it effective?
Well, nonviolence is effective, and it often is not. There are no guarantees in life. The best scholars, Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth, 10 years ago, came out with a study of maximalist, meaning very extreme kind of nonviolent struggles since 1900. And they did an analysis that showed that nonviolent struggle was twice as likely to succeed as an armed struggle. Mm-hmm. There's no guarantee that either will work. It's true that sometimes nonviolence and violence is done in a way that doesn't succeed, either because it's poorly planned or because the opponent is very strong and is a more capable adversary. So there is a component of violence and nonviolence action that is a performance piece of helplessness. And we do see people kind of performing in a way for the public about their despair and their grievances in a way that is not likely to bring any kind of success, but at least it's used as a communication effort that they're hurting and that they want to change.
What do you have in mind as?
Right. I mean, typically people use a lot of nonviolence when they don't have access to the regular institutions which make change. And that is elections, that is legislation, that is the court system. And so when groups, marginalized voices or peoples are feeling like those institutions are not meeting their needs, they then go to either armed violence or they go to nonviolent action. And so that's a huge body or range of work outside of those big institutions that I just mentioned. And so there is almost by definition the use of nonviolence in many cases, not all, by people who are marginalized. There is a kind of nonviolence, which is a constructive nonviolence, which is a very powerful one, not always done by marginalized people, but it is a way, we call it configurative politics or acting out the future today. This is where people change the world by creating the future today. One example of this is the gay and lesbian movement having same-sex marriages beginning in the early 70s. And saying, you know what, we're not going to wait for the straight world or the legal world to permit us to get married. We are going to get married ourselves and create the institutions they created in some kind of the Metropolitan Community Church, which is a trans-lesbian gay church. But they also got the Quakers and the Unitarian Universalists and the Progressive Jews and others to start doing this in some religious denominations. And so they created the future today, even though there was tremendous opposition in society. So constructive nonviolent action does not always get as much attention as the grievance kind of, or what we call confrontational nonviolent action. But this distinction is a primary distinction I make in the survey in my book, which is to say that, yes, we need to be looking at confrontational action, which sometimes is one done out of despair or helplessness or and doesn't always win. but we also need to be looking at those constructive nonviolent actions, which can change our culture and change the world through our mere organizing and action.
Okay, I guess I was, you gave me pause when you first mentioned the notion of uh, per, performed demonstration of helplessness, because this is not a category that I had ever thought about before. And except, what it made me think of is the ways in which this being unarmed, showing that you're unarmed, that you're unable to be harmful to others, means that you're going to enlist the sympathies of people. If you are attacked, you're more likely, the world is going to say, well, they're going to know who the bad guy is for attacking you, because you clearly are unarmed and incapable of harming, and show no intention of harming your adversary. But that's not what you meant. So when you said demonstration
Right.
of helplessness, I want you to
Let me give you an
give me some
example.
examples. Yeah.
Let me give you an example. I was at a protest 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., and it was a protest in support of the Myanmar people who are really suffering from a coup d'etat. There was a protest out in front of the International Labor Organization, because the Myanmar community wants the International Labor Organization and the other UN institutions to recognize the opposition government, not to recognize the military government. So they call this protest, and I arrive at the protest. There are only 7 people or 8 people, 10 people maybe. And I said, well, why don't we go upstairs and talk to them, to the International Labor Organization, and talk to them? People were like, well, I don't know, I'm scared. That we'd rather protest out front on a sidewalk and do a performance of helplessness and grievance than actually go into the building and go up to the 3rd floor and make the direct request of not a hostile, the International Labor Organization, the workers there will probably agree with us and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
they might say, it's not our decision. It's in Geneva where the decision is made, blah, blah, but thank you for coming. And we'll say, can you pass the report along? And they'd say, well, yes or no. But this is an example where people sometimes fetishize protesting over actually doing the real kind of advocacy work that needs to be done.
Yeah,
and I've seen this
fascinating.
happen many times. This is not just the Burmese solidarity community. I've seen this happen many, many times where people would protest out in front of somebody's house or whatever, but they don't go up to the door and knock, or they don't go into the congressional office or the parliamentary office and actually talk to staff people or to protest there or bring their demands right there. They rather do a performance piece. And this is what I'm referring to. We also have the people who are like, oh, I want to get arrested for such and such. And so they go through a kind of a performance piece of like crossing a line to get arrested, for the police. And, it's performance and it's okay. But they're not really looking at a serious nonviolent action that disrupts or really would have a strong impact other than through a kind of a theatrical presentation and say, oh, I got arrested kind of thing.
Okay, got it. That is kind of a new thought to me. I guess I haven't thought about that before, but that sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Now you also mentioned something else early on in your little exposition, where you were talking about the gray area between violence and nonviolence. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, now that's something I'd like for you to explore, because I haven't been there before either.
Oh, I think you have been probably, Meta. I will remind you of some of this anyway, and that is that in my book I talk about some of these gray areas, such as property destruction.
Mm-hmm. Sabotage.
And what kinds of property destruction can be classified as nonviolent action and those that can't, not really easily. And there's just differences of opinion. These are culturally driven. They're conflict dependent. Each conflict is different. Many people believe if you destroy your own property, if you're an artist and you destroy your own work or your whatever, destroying your own property, that this is not really violent and not, yeah. There are other people that think that if you're going to destroy somebody else's property, in most cases without their permission, that this is violent. You're violating them in a very substantial way, that obviously not physically, but maybe psychically. And then you have disputes about common property, government property or commons property. Can you destroy money, which is really commons property? Can you plant trees on a street, which is public property, but you want to have less streets and more gardens and more trees? Where do you draw the lines of what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate in terms of what about burning a draft card? A draft card, for those of you who don't know, happened for people, men who were conscripted into the military, and these are basically public documents, and you burn your draft card as a symbol of resistance to joining the military, going to a war. Again, where do you draw the lines? One of the great groups that we know that challenges us very much is Plowshares. Plowshares is a group primarily in North America.
So that's the one with the W. We have our own project, Plowshares, with
yes,
a PH.
And the Plowshares activists that I'm referring to here are those who go in and bang on nose cones and nuclear weapons and go into nuclear weapons sites to do what they can to directly disarm the weapons of mass destruction, which may exterminate all life on Earth within a few hours. So is that property destruction or not? Or even if it is violence, is it legitimate to use in a nonviolent campaign? I mean, the religiously inclined Christians would say we're beating swords into plowshares. There's nothing violent about that. And if you do consider that violence, then it's still perfectly justified. So this is one of the gray areas of property damage. And there are a number of other areas too.
Well, I would agree with you, certainly, that what all the categories, all the tactics that you've mentioned so far are ethical quandaries or pose some possible dilemmas. I'm not sure all of them are, cases in which you'd ask whether or not this is really violence or not. But there are also other, take self-destructive actions which are indeed violent, but or at least harmful to the body, as even fasting unto death, kind of thing. That to me is a real ethical problem. And I have ethical questions all the time about other manifestations, which may not even be protest movements. I'm thinking of a time, of 20 years ago, when I was caught on a freeway, unable to get off for hours because the Shriners were running their little cars around on the street below, and the exit was blocked. So I couldn't get off, and I needed to go to the bathroom. And I also had to have a meeting that I was supposed to be at. So I remember just fuming and I don't even like the idea of some of these parades now these are not protest movements at all. They're perfectly normal actions that are accepted as a sacrifice that we should all make for the sake of, I don't know, solidarity or spirit of community or something, but which nevertheless really do impose hardship on some people in ways that I think, I'm not always so sure I approve of. But those aren't questions of whether there's violence involved, but there are all kinds of moral quandaries to me that can arise.
Yes, generally speaking, what I like to tell young people is I say there are two questions you're going to ask in your life over and over again around personal issues, around your group, around your career, around public policy. And the first one is, what is the right thing to do? Or is it a right thing to do? And is it an effective thing to do? And sometimes those answers line up nicely and sometimes they don't. And when I mean right, I mean I'm usually using the word ethical. Is this something I feel comfortable doing as an ethical mean? And it's can be really challenging when these issues don't line up. Some people would say to the plowshare activists in the United States doing direct disarmament that you like, this is not effective. Why are you doing this? We know you're religious and you're doing this because you believe it. And they say, yes, we believe this is the right thing to do. And we don't know God's will and we're doing what is right. We're not primarily doing this because we know it's effective, but because somebody has to do something. And without action on any other front, we're going to do what we can. And so they've answered that question saying, okay, for them, the effectiveness issue is not one that they have full control or clarity over. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do. So I would encourage people to use those two queries. Nonviolence is often not effective. It's not planned well. We hope that people will read our book and learn about some of the elements that come into plan to do tactics well. People have good intentions, and if they don't plan well, the action is not effective, and therefore the campaign can lose. So we want people
It's
to be
a very
effective.
important issue, and I think we ought to play with that a little bit. Um, because this, in a way, comes up when I have people, I have conversations often about the importance of hope. And this may not sound related, but I think it is. Um, I say I don't get I don't get down too much if I lose because I don't work out of the energy of hope. I work out of the energy of duty. And if I think I'm supposed to do something, and if I know that it's not going to work, it's not going to be effective, it's not going to make any difference, the end of the world is coming. As a matter of fact, right now, I think it may be. The extinction event may be right here upon us, and we may not be able to fix it.
That's right.
And I wouldn't make any bets on it. But I'm still going to do what I'm going to do, which is what I think is my duty. And it may not, it's not because I think it's going to be effective, and I don't necessarily have any hope that it's going to work, but I want to, well, I don't know if you want to put an image to it, be like, when I get to the pearly gates, I want to be able to say I did my best and I did what I thought I should do, whether or not it was something that was going to work. Now, is that related to this question? There are a lot of other times when this comes up, when you think about whether, if you really, the effectiveness is all that counts. If you lean more toward the effectiveness, you become quite an opportunist, right? You could be, that's the extreme version of focusing on effectiveness.
Right.
And on the other hand, you have idealists who are absolutely impractical, who go the other direction. Do you actually encounter that as a dilemma very often when you're out planning or engaged in an action? Is this something you actually have to think about much or very often, or is it pretty obvious?
You have to think about it a lot because there are many elements, even within an action, where you have to make choices. You have to make strategic choices. Are we going to emphasize this? Or are we going to emphasize that? Um, uh, Details matter. We know the universe is complicated, and the little butterfly that flaps its wings in the Amazon can, through a series of impacts, impact the weather up in the Arctic. So details matter, and your actions, the use of your privilege matters. Um, I know, for example, doing climate protests here in, well, anywhere, that we seem to have a lot of people who are uh, making decisions to do climate protests with signs that are made out of fossil fuels. And okay, well, are we going to ban people from having, somebody shows up with a vinyl sign or a plastic sign that says down with pipeline this or whatnot? Are we going to say tell that person to go away? You can't show up with your fossil fuel sign to be protesting fossil fuels? Or do you welcome them, say, okay, well, try to educate them to say, okay, please understand that we're trying to have, be consistent with our messaging and not, to the degree possible, use fossil fuels in our protests. But we're all addicted to oil, and most people get to their protest using some sort of fossil fuel in some way, whether it's the clothes they're wearing,
Yeah.
or on and on and on and on. So you can take these issues to an extreme degree. But I just wanted to give you a funny little example that it's not that happens all the time at fossil fuel protests. And where do you draw the line, and how do you draw the line, and what do you do about it? Can make a difference. So,
That's one I hadn't encountered before, but of course.
yeah. So
Yeah.
environmental activists near me, we try to use poles that are made out of bamboo, not out of PVC. We try to use reusable and renewable materials in our signage, rather than.
Do you think anybody notices? I mean, anybody who isn't part of the planning committee.
You never know,
I
right?
mean, I could have been there, and I wouldn't have, if you'd been carrying a plastic sign, I wouldn't have been offended, because it's just part of, the world to me.
Exactly. But we have choices all the time. I know Peace Brigades International, which is a group that I did a lot of work with for many years, which is a group that really promoted, helped make the third-party nonviolent universe blossom. Third-party nonviolence is what parents do between squabbling children. You intervene, a third party intervenes nonviolently. And we see this done at the international level with peace brigades and other groups intervening in countries to try to protect human rights defenders who might be assassinated or imprisoned by various armed actors in the country. And so we're going in there, we're using our privilege as North Americans or Europeans or internationals to go protect people. Now, in some respects, we are using our privilege, which is based on our skin color and our appearance, to help keep human rights defenders alive. In a way, we're using the racist belief systems of the people in the society that show that people of European heritage have more privilege than others, more power than others, and we're reinforcing that kind of racist stereotype by using that to keep a human rights defender alive. Now, is that an appropriate thing to do or not? And if so, are there ways to ameliorate this way that you might be reinforcing society's less than healthy ideas? So ethics absolutely is so important in nonviolence. And you can take a utilitarian approach where effectiveness is the only thing that matters, but you pretty soon get off the rails. And that's why I like to think of the two hands of nonviolence that Barbara Deming talks about. And she talks about how stop what you're doing. I'm not going to cooperate with what you're doing. I'm going to disrupt. I'm going to stop whatever I can to do. I'll act. And the other hand is, I care about you. I'm not going to kill you. You're part of the solution. And the two hands also are the same two hands that talked about both effectiveness on one hand and on morality or ethics on the other.
Okay, now you've come close to another issue that really bothers me a lot, and that is the international norms about when it's appropriate and acceptable to participate in or attempt to influence political decisions in another country, or
Mm,
defend dissidents, for example,
yep.
in another country, if they to what extent do we have the right to take any kind of, to give money to, it's illegal, now to give money to Russian dissidents, or many other countries. I think, matter of fact, in the US, it's also illegal for American organizations to receive foreign money. So this is pretty well accepted, that there are national borders that we have to observe and recognize, and rules, etc. And I don't like it, because I feel a moral obligation to do everything I can to help people who are, uh, doing what I believe in, and who need support.
I
But
generally, I
I
generally agree
think,
with you.
I believe that a year or so ago, people at ICNC had a book on that
Yes,
topic.
yes,
I tried to get hold of it, and I've never been able to
yes.
get.
It's a free a book. All their books are free.
Yeah.
They talked about, they did a research on solidarity uh, work around the world, and what kind of solidarity work tends to be effective, and what kind of solidarity work is less effective. Um, I agree with you. I think that we are human beings first. We have world citizens' responsibilities that come first before those of the nation states, and therefore we need to operate under that primary directive. It is very important for us, however, to uh, be aware of our privilege and our role of as foreigners or outsiders, if you want to use that term, and take the lead to the best of our ability from local people who would be the stakeholders who would be most likely to um, uh, have an impact from what you do as a solidarity person. So, for example, peace brigades would never have gone to Latin America to protect people unless they weren't invited to do so in a very not trivial invitation, kind of, but a very deeply well thought out invitation. And we need to be listening to indigenous people, and local groups, and following their lead to them as much as possible, and supporting their efforts, particularly when the grievance is a local one or a regional one, to enable them to address the issue as much as possible with us in a support role. There's a group called the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which we're fiscal sponsor of, which talks about co-resistance. And they very much want to, and are, working with Palestinians, with Palestinian leadership, following Palestinian leadership, to try to do what they can to end the occupation of the West Bank, for example, or the expulsions in East Jerusalem. And they operate from what they call a co-resistance model. And I think solidarity activists around the world, rather than being loose cannons, even if nonviolent cannons, or loose cowboys or cowgirls, to be co-resisting with local people, or the people for whom the stakes are the highest. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is, but I would want to take some exception to this assumption that it's always that we're always so privileged, and that we have so much influence. Oftentimes, I think, um, we're resented, and it being say, North American, it does not give you extra weight. It is a very strong argument against participating in somebody else's affairs. So I'm thinking in terms of, shouldn't we have other kinds of exceptions that are institutionalized for allowing, the concerns of people from other countries, whether they're on the right side, the wrong side, or upside down, uh, to be represented officially, openly, legally, in every country. In other words, why not? Why not have a place where Nonviolence International, for example, could have a base Beijing or in Moscow and organize events and promote your ideas and so on. Why not have that become a perfectly legitimate kind of thing? But if we do that, then they have there should equally be the opportunity for some, I don't know, some nationalistic group who some uh, group that we would consider probably not very civilized to have their base in Washington or in Ottawa and promote whatever they want. I'm perfectly willing for them to do that as long as it's clear who they are and what they're standing for, and we can have our debates. We can have our conflicts.
I
But
agree with you.
I don't feel like ratifying and reinforcing the boundaries that exist between states that say that if you're not a citizen of this country, you have no right to speak up or participate in any way to help the people that you're aligned with. That's just my feeling.
Yes, we do have Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees every human on earth the right to speech and to speak and to be heard. And this is a universal right. And a lot of Americans I talk to think that somehow this is only a US right with the First Amendment in the United States. This is a global right that all of the countries have signed on to. And it is um, a right that we should fiercely protect um, and and build on. When it comes to the idea of moving resources, it gets a little trickier. If international groups want to open up in other countries and bringing in outside resources to open up things in a country, that gets complicated. I would say that generally speaking, we would like generally a fairly freewheeling, open set of societies around the world that will welcome views that aren't always the mainstream views that are liked by many. We do need a strong emphasis on transparency, particularly around resources, which is not a full answer, but we do need transparency, whether it's around NGOs or the kinds of funds that come in to NGOs or corporations, which are the for-profit corporations, which are the much bigger players. We do need strong transparency kind of mechanisms that are built in, and some of this is missing now. And we need to be building up uh, support for transparent structures around the world, so that we talk about free speech. But if I have a megaphone and you don't, yeah, we both have free speech, but I have a huge advantage. So
Exactly.
we need to be careful about the resource question and not ban necessarily resources from moving by groups or agencies from one place to another, but to be really transparent about it at the very least.
Yes, and I just wondered if there are any kind of standards that you can think of that would be fair for all sides. I can't think of a rule for how you'd say, what should be the rights of donating to NGOs in other countries and so on. I've had people say, well, I feel it's okay for individuals. We should have the right as individuals to help fund like-minded organizations and groups in other countries that don't want us. I mean, the government may not want us, but that it wouldn't be fair for the government to do so. So they don't like, for example, U.S. I can't think of acronyms today. But
USAID.
yeah, things that support um, resistance movements overseas, but are funded by the government. I don't know. Is that kind of a criterion that would hold up and be defensible in whichever side of the divide you're coming from, or can you think of a better one?
Well, I think supporting, we're at Nonviolence International. We don't support certainly armed resistance, funding armed resistance movements around the world, even when some of these marginalized peoples have big grievances. We've seen a lot of disasters in recent years. It's rare that an armed struggle can win and have a good democratic outcome. It's usually a lose-lose situation. We can look at Libya, we can look at Syria, we can look at Yemen, and others uh, where international support, whether it's from government or from civil society, for kind of armed struggle or violent resolution of the conflict, is not really going to succeed and is very damaging. Um, Generally speaking, I think we want a world that is not dominated by national states, but we want vibrant civil societies, vibrant religious institutions. Uh, uh, if we do have modern corporate capitalism, we want there to be as much transparency and public accountability as possible. And so we do want to see, particularly on the civil society side of things, support for people to be able to give resources and support to other people around the world, or groups giving support to other groups. When it gets into the profit-making territory, it's a little trickier. When it gets into elections, it gets a little trickier. Uh, uh, we've
Yeah.
seen that there can be real damage when when there's substantial international support that interferes with the elections around the world. Our whole election system is something that you've focused on a bit, seeing how elections and democracy have not always brought the best leadership. We've got a lot of bad leadership in the world today, some of which is elected supposedly, in democratic countries. And we really have to double down to improve this whole arena of of allowing better leadership to emerge. And I do think that limitations on international kind of interference in local elections, national elections, is probably warranted.
I do too, but I don't think that's going to make decision making necessarily any better. It's not the support, for example, for Trump was not caused because some foreigners were trying to influence
Correct.
American policies. It's caused by American stupidity, if you'll forgive the expression. And I say that as a dual citizen. I'm still an American. There's a hell of a lot of stupidity out there these days, and it worries me to the extent that I think it isn't necessarily the institutions, or we can't change the institutions in a favorable direction because people are so crazy, and we got to change people's heads, which is a regressive. From my mind, it's a step backward, because I always assumed years and years ago I can't change human beings, but it's easier for me to change institutions than people. And we fix the institutions, and that'll make people behave themselves a little better. And I've believed that for a long time, but I don't believe it anymore. I think we have to change people's heads. And I don't know, that means you can't do it individually, but I'm thinking we have to do it through somehow influencing the culture, the way public representations of legitimacy are portrayed in our discourse, and in our fiction, and in our dramas, and in our celebrations, etc. We have to maybe try to make an impact that way. I don't know.
I believe
Anyway,
you are partially correct here. I think the cultural resistance, which is something I write about a lot in the book Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century, it's a dimension of nonviolence that Gene Sharp did not write about originally 50 years ago in much detail. And there is an enormous amount of work that's being done by indigenous people around the world to preserve their cultures, by creating vast new cultures, or expanding vast new cultures, for example, around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, who it looks like now probably make up more than 10% of the world's population, uh, and which is an enormous number of people, 770 million people. Uh, we're seeing new cultures, life affirming ones, emerge. We are seeing Black Lives Matter in the United States, as well as anti-caste activity in India and other places in the world where minorities are stepping up and saying we don't want to be mistreated or treated differently based on our appearance or our ethnicity. And so in terms of the whole social equality field, we've seen real changes in culture around the world and continue to, many of them positive, not all. We have um, uh, a lot of work to do still around classism or wealth disparities around the world. I think the recent vaccine apartheid that we've seen, where the rich countries, including myself here in this United States, my teenage kids are getting the vaccines before elderly or healthcare workers are in many countries of the world. And that's just insanity. It's not right on so many levels, including public health sensibilities. So um, there are important cultural memes. I think artists, and we share a lot about in our nonviolent tactics, we talk about the role of artists who are so important about getting into people's heads and getting people to think differently and see things differently and in healthy ways, really play a major role in social change actions, whether it's through branding or whether it's now through the all the video and stuff done online to help people see things in new ways. There's great, and we all know the power of music. There are wonderful ways in which society continues to grow and to improve, to get more voices at the table. But clearly, we have problem around classism and economic wealth disparities. It needs a lot of work. We also have a lot of problem around violence. We still glorify violence around the world. It's a way of, of that young men in particular and men can perpetuate their traditional patriarchal views that those people with upper body strength and can do a lot of direct violence are ones that should make the decisions and rule the world. And we have 190 some nation states, with the exception of maybe Costa Rica and a couple of others, that they all have armies and militaries. And the idea that we have all of these armed states around the world and that we're going to resolve our issues with all of these heavily armed actors who are on hair trigger or alert and can lead to catastrophic destruction because modern weaponry is so destructive. We've got some real problems around cultural issues to work on, as you stated, in the violence arena. So we would encourage people to look at nonviolent action both in constructive ways and in confrontational ways. The world is very interconnected now, so in fact, nonviolent action, disruptive kind of nonviolent action, can have a very big impact because we are so interconnected. You can do things now in North America that will impact people in Southeast Asia economically, socially, politically, and that's a power that should be used ethically and well, and so that we can not just prevent. It's rather sad if existence is our only goal. I encourage you to read my book, to learn more about nonviolent tactics, to learn what others are doing. Please come to our.
Let's get. I think you said you have something like 250 tactics.
350 now.
350. So you have just about doubled Gene Sharp's list.
Right.
And I haven't ever made a kind of an inventory of new tactics. Can you give us some examples of
I sure can.
Tactics that have emerged since Gene made his list?
Yes. Divestment is something that didn't exist in 1973 or just had started. That was primarily promoted during the South African anti-apartheid movement. And this is the idea that people with their dollars could divest from companies that were doing business in South Africa. In this case, we have divestment campaigns around fossil fuels and around the military coup in Burma and other places. The idea here is that you as a shareholder or as an owner can withdraw your funds from a company, and that this can have some impact. Frankly, this is primarily a communication impact, generally speaking, because somebody else will buy your ownership, and it hasn't shown to have a big impact on change, except that it brings a lot of publicity to an issue, and it brings a lot of publicity within that corporation. So that's a very interesting new tactic that's now being used around the world, divestment. Another one that we can point to is the tactic of surveillance, S-O-U-S, surveillance, not surveillance. Surveillance is the French word that talks about what governments and corporations do to us, where they're surveilling us with their cameras and their invasive monitoring through the internet. Surveillance is the French word S-O-U-S is from under. And it's we are surveilling the authorities. We are surveilling the corporations with our cameras, with our phones, with our technologies. A great example of this is the recent last year, the surveillance of the police who killed George Floyd. And even though the person holding the camera was told by the police to turn off the camera and not to do this, they kept the camera on, and the whole world showed that George Floyd was killed by this police officer, murdered. And then it was shared around the world and had such a big impact, not just around racial issues, but also around police violence issues around the world. So we can surveil and are surveilling the authorities every single day as they are trying to surveil us.
I love that.
There are many others, many hundreds of others you can go to our website to see, and we would welcome additionally others that you find that we should include in the database, because we want everybody in the world to feel like they have a big toolbox of tactics that they could go to, and maybe one or two could be appropriate for their context.
Well, I think what is needed also is not just a list, but also something more than that in terms of a discussion of how to strategize about which tactics to use when. I'm aware of the fact that in the last 10 years, the effectiveness of civil resistance has not been as impressive as it used to be. Maybe it's more than 10 years now, but at least 10 years. It's been going downhill compared to what it used to be, and maybe even as a fraction or as a ratio of the success of violent actions. I'm not sure about that. I think violent is still much in favor of nonviolence in terms of what works, but it's not working as well as it used to. And as I understand, people who've been studying that, notably, I believe Erica Chenoweth, but others also, that maybe people have got the idea that it's so easy to call a meeting, a public protest meeting. You pick up your cell phones and you speed dial, and you get a whole bunch of people. You tell them, let's meet at such and such a square at 9:00, and they'll come. But you haven't done anything to build the organization that you're going to need to carry out a more sustained, and suppose you win. They turn over the keys, they all go away, and you now have access to the palace. But what are you going to do the next day? If you haven't planned it, it's not so cool. Now, I think I had a conversation with Gene Sharp once in which I said I was at that point tending toward the view that we should actually think further about what we're going to do after winning, before starting things out, and that kind of political planning or developing a shadow government or something of that kind should be part of the activity from the get-go. And he didn't like that idea. I mean, he felt it was more, his business was showing how to get rid of the dictator, and then after that, that wasn't his bag. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I would like to challenge a little bit your assumption that civil resistance does not work as well as it used to. Uh, Governments have been learning as well, and so they have been repressing civil space. And so, indeed, perhaps there are more authoritarian regimes now, and the civil resistance movements. There are a whole lot more of them, but they're not. Many of them are not working. It could be that you're right, but there have been some recent successes. Sudan in 2019 was an enormous success against a 30-year entrenched Islamist dictator who was very violent, and the people were extremely nonviolent and very well organized, led by the Sudanese People's Association, which is basically a professionals association, which is basically professional unions. And they brought down a dictator there. Also in 2019, I believe, was the big change in Armenia, where People Power brought down the authoritarian leader in Armenia. So we have had some recent successes, and without, I think, a single person getting killed in that one. So there have been some successes. I don't want to, and remember, Erica Chenoweth focuses on the maximalist civil resistance cases of people who are struggling for leadership. And indeed, a lot of authoritarians are winning that struggle at the moment. But I also mentioned all the social movement stuff that gets into people's heads. That's the long-term cultural change. We could be winning on the fossil fuel front, ecology front, equality front, justice front. So it's a big mixed bag. But you're right. The whole idea of what you do after you come to power, if there is a quote-unquote revolution, is terribly important. We do know that nonviolent struggles tend to lead to better outcomes than armed insurrections. But we've really got to focus on what are we doing about the closure of space. They're making everything illegal now in Russia, in China, in Philippines, in Thailand, in Myanmar. I mean, there's so many countries, North Korea, even in India, you're getting an authoritarian regime. Look what they're doing in Kashmir to the Kashmiris, putting an entire country, state under an open air prison. And so we are seeing the closure of space where even free speech and normal kind of everyday activities are being criminalized. And it's one of the challenges we have in the modern society now. I know we have to finish up, is that every one of us breaks a law 2 or 3 times a day. There's so many laws, and the government only needs 1 or 2, and then they can persecute you on this, even if they don't really, it's really a political matter. You know, you jaywalked, or you have a grain of sand in your car that came from a national park because you went swimming in the grain of sand and you can't move anything from a national park, or gosh knows, they come up with ridiculous stuff. So we do have a real challenge, all the world. We need to empower civil society, which is what you're so good about doing, because unless civil society really rears its head and really speaks up, these authoritarian governments are not going to help us solve the world's problems that we have today.
Wow. Okay. That you are absolutely right. And I'm extremely glad that you're in Washington, D.C., because that's where we need people like you right there. And if you have a few more folks, we'll send them to several of the other capitals in the world. Michael, this has been wonderful, very informative and very inspiring. So it's Godspeed. You're doing wonderful work, and keep it up. It's great to be on your team.
Thank you, Meta. It's an honor to be with you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.